Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week, in the seventh and final week of this Easter season, we jump to the book of Acts and the story of how Judas came to be replaced as one of the 12. But before we look at that, if you've not done so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which is just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of our reading, some other passages that you might like to look up, the questions that we'll be considering later on, and plenty of space for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Acts chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, and then verses 21 to 26. The disciples at this point are gathered in Jerusalem, and specifically in the upper room where they're staying in that city. And we're told in verse 15 that there was about 120 people in total. So we've got a significant number of people who are there or thereabouts. This follows Jesus ascending into heaven, which we're told in verse 12 of this chapter that the disciples witnessed on the Mount of Olives. And since then, they were told that they devoted themselves to prayer. That's what we learn in verse 14. So that's the setting. The disciples prayerfully gathered in that upper room. The lectionary notice leaves out a chunk of the reading, verses 18 to 20, and that tells us about the death of Judas in the field that he bought using the silver that he'd obtained when he betrayed Jesus to the religious authorities. So there are a lot of characters with up to 120 people kicking around in the scene. It's useful just to point out the named people who are significant in this episode. So although he's dead by this point, Judas, as a former member of the 12, actually features quite prominently in the background, and it's finding a replacement for him which makes up the content of today's reading. We're told that there were certain women, as Luke puts it, who were part of this group. It's likely that they were people who travelled from Galilee to Jerusalem with Jesus, having supported him financially. We learn about that in Luke's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. And we know also that they were witnesses to both the crucifixion and the resurrection. So it's likely that when Luke says certain women, he means people for whom that had been their experience. Note also that Luke tells us that some of Jesus' immediate family were present, his mother and his brothers. They get a more favourable treatment in Luke's Gospel compared to how they're portrayed in, for example, Mark chapter 3 verse 21 or John chapter 7 verse 5, where they're sceptical at best and downright hostile to what Jesus is doing at worst. One of the key people in this passage is Peter, who takes charge of the situation and emerges as the early leader. And we've got two people who are, again, key to this passage, but we don't actually know very much about. We've got Barsabbas, who was also known apparently as Joseph or Justus, and he was one of those two people who were put forward as a potential new member of the 12. And we've also got Matthias, who was the person who was eventually chosen to replace Judas. So we've got a lot of specific people in among that 120 folk. And it's useful as we read this passage to remember that Luke wrote 2 volumes. Firstly, what we now call the Gospel of Luke, and then secondly, the book of Acts, all around the time 80 to 85 of the Common Era, mostly for an audience of Gentile Christians. And the author didn't witness most of what they narrated, including these events, so it's kind of second or maybe even third-hand account of what happened in the beginning of things. But it's useful to note that we're picking up essentially where the Gospel of Luke has left off for us. We see in this passage the decision being made by the drawing of lots as to who would replace Judas. And it might be helpful to look at 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 36 to 44, to see how the drawing of lots was quite often used as a way of discerning the will of God. In that case, deciding the relative guilt of the King Saul and his son and God's people. So diving into the actual content of the text, the 12 were people who played a really significant role in the ministry of Jesus. So in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 6, verses 13 to 16, the 12 are named for us. And there were people who we know accompanied Jesus in proclaiming the kingdom of God, as we learn at the start of chapter 8, who were given power to cure diseases and cast out demons, as we learned at the start of chapter 9, and who very much formed Jesus' inner circle. They were his confidants. We learn that in Luke 9, verse 12. So there was a significance in wanting to be 12 again, just for the fact that that was the size of the key group that had surrounded Jesus. The lasting impact on that group of Judas's betrayal is very much evident in verses 17 and 25 of today's passage, where we're told basically that Judas had an equal share with the others in the ministry that Jesus had given them all, but chose to turn aside and go to his own place, chose to walk away from that by betraying Jesus. Now, while it's possibly true that the 11 could have gone on to function perfectly well as a unit, there was a symbolic significance to there being 12 that went beyond just that was the number they had been. Israel had originally 12 tribes, and there was a sense of each of the 12 kind of representing one of those tribes, and thus by being that group of 12 representing the kind of revitalization of the people of Israel that was taking place through the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. And so there was a symbolic significance in restoring them to that number so that they could carry on spreading the gospel outwards from Jerusalem, as they'd been told to do right at the very end of Luke's Gospel at the end of chapter 24. It's interesting, given that symbolic significance, that actually they were only reconstructed once. So when James was killed by King Herod in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 of Acts, he's not replaced. So this is a kind of one-off, wanting to get back to that perfect number of 12. And as I say, Peter, in this context, we learn in verse 15, takes the initiative and emerges as the early leader who says, actually, this is important, folks, we need to do this. There was no fixed pattern for how it ought to be done, and it appears that Peter was kind of working things out as he went along. So it makes sense, perhaps, that he would turn to Old Testament sources and say, well, how did they make important decisions back then? In this case, say, by the casting of lots. And it's interesting that when Peter makes his speech to the others, that the death of Judas and his choice of replacement are cast as being foretold by the Hebrew scriptures. So we hear something of that in verse 16 and in the nugget that we miss out in verse 20. There were particular criteria for selection to be a potential new apostle, which means witness to the resurrection, as we see in chapter 2, verse 32. You had to be a bloke, you had to be male, and you had to have been someone who'd come along, been part of the journey from the very beginning, back to the point where Jesus was baptized by his cousin John the Baptist in the River Jordan, and right through to him having been raised from the dead. So that's the criteria that we find in verses 21 and 22. But it's important to note, having recognised the maleness there, that there are examples of female apostles in the New Testament. So in Paul's ministry, in his letter to the Romans, in chapter 16, verse 7, he refers to a woman called Junia as an apostle. Now, there have been points in the church's history where it's basically been unable to deal with that fact. And there was a previous pope who decided it couldn't possibly be Junia, it must be Junius, it must be a male. But there is no record of anyone being called Junius at that time. There's a record of a lot of people being called Junia. So I reckon, despite some of the uncomfortableness of the church down the centuries with that text, we can take it as read that Paul did indeed refer to a woman as an apostle. And we see other examples of that as well. So in John's Gospel, we see the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, being very much portrayed as an apostle as she witnesses to what she's found of Jesus to her fellow Samaritans. And of course, in John chapter 20, we find Mary Magdalene basically being the apostle to the apostles, in that she's literally the first witness to the resurrection, who then tells the others what she's seen. So it's important, therefore, to take away from this that the criteria in Acts 1, 21 and 22 does not give us the last word on who could be an apostle. And moreover, it's not the last word on the ministry of women in today's context either. The outcome of the decision between the two figures that emerge, Barsabbas and Matthias, is framed very much in verse 24 as the decision of God. And it's interesting that making this choice by drawing lots wasn't contested, it seems, by any of the people present. And it's a remarkably peaceful decision-making process in what must have actually been very turbulent and challenging circumstances. Fascinatingly, we actually know nothing about these two men, Barsabbas and Matthias, the two possible candidates as replacements for Judas. And Matthias, who is the one who was chosen by the casting of lots, doesn't actually get mentioned again throughout the rest of the book of Acts. So there's a symbolic power in the unification of the 12, and they very much seem to behave as a unit, but individually we know nothing about Judas's replacement. They are very prominent in the first 5 chapters or so of Acts, but then the 12 kind of disappear after chapter 6 verse 2. We don't see any further reference to them as a unit in Acts. And Peter, who as I emerged as that early leader, is a very prominent figure in the first half of Acts, but then again he kind of slips out of the picture after chapter 15 verse 7, when we learn that James and the elders emerged as the leaders in Jerusalem. And in the second half of Acts, the focus very much becomes on the ministry of Paul. So there's a sense of the baton being handed on from the original 12 of the leaders in Jerusalem to Paul and ministry to the Gentiles, with those he brought along with him, like Silas and Barnabas, for example. So we're seeing that spreading out of the gospel gradually from a close-knit group in Jerusalem out to all nations, and indeed across barriers of gender and whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, or whether you were a slave or free, or any number of other possible ways that we could divide ourselves up one from another. So it's a fascinating passage, perhaps as much as anything else for what we don't know, as much as what we do. And I hope you find that today's questions enable you to go more deeply into what we might learn from it.